On the afternoon Paris was liberated, George Patton did the most important thing of his entire campaign. He left. No balcony, no parade, no cameras beside Charles de Gaulle, no speech beneath the Arc de Triomphe. While the city screamed itself hoarse with relief, Patton pointed his driver away from the capital and toward the next river. Drive. That one word looked like impatience. It looked like ego. It looked like the old cavalryman chasing another bridge before anyone could pin a medal on him. But to Dwight Eisenhower, it was something far more useful. It was proof. Because in 1944, the question tearing through liberated France was not only who defeated Germany, it was who owns France now. And Eisenhower had quietly placed the most politically reckless general in the American army into the one role no diplomat could perform. George Patton was not there to charm France. He was there to prove the Americans were not staying. The strange part is that Patton never knew it. The first test came almost 2 years earlier, before Normandy, before Paris, before the world knew what Patton's tanks could do in France. November 7, 1942. 200 miles off French Morocco, the USS Augusta moved through the Atlantic with her lights killed and her radios silent. Below deck, in a cramped cabin that smelled of oil, salt, and steel, Patton sat at a folding desk with a journal open in front of him. He was 56 years old, a major general, a man built out of swagger, discipline, profanity, old wars, old books, and one bright pair of ivory-handled revolvers. And he was writing about the French, not the Germans, not Rommel, not victory. The French. Because in a few hours, American guns would open fire on soldiers who, in another century, had been America's oldest allies. Lafayette's country, Belleau Wood's country, the country American soldiers had died beside in 1918. Now Patton's task force was moving toward Fadala, Safi, and Medea with tens of thousands of men and more than 100 ships. On the beaches, French colonial forces were waiting under Vichy command. Patton understood the problem before the first shell landed. If he humiliated them, they would resist him after the shooting stopped. If he treated them like conquered men, they would make every American order feel like occupation. If he treated them like allies who had been forced into a terrible mistake, then something else might be possible. That was the part of Patton most people missed. The pistols were loud. The mouth was louder. But under all of it, he had the instincts of an old-world officer. He knew uniforms mattered. He knew salutes mattered. He knew language mattered. He knew that a defeated general can forgive defeat more easily than disrespect. At dawn on November 8th, the American fleet began firing into Casablanca's defenses. The unfinished French battleship Jean Bart fired back from the harbor. Shells fell close enough to throw spray over the Augusta. Smoke rolled across the water. Men drowned in the surf. Americans and Frenchmen killed each other on beaches where neither side wanted the real war to be. 3 days later, on November 11th, the guns went silent. Armistice Day. That was the day General Auguste Noguès, the French resident general in Morocco, came through the American lines under a white flag. He expected humiliation. Patton gave him ceremony. Not in a muddy command tent, not in a hard chair beneath a guard's stare, in a hotel dining room at Fadala. The room had been cleared. The tables were set. French wine had been found. Patton's officers wore dress uniforms. And when Noguès entered, Patton did something no defeated French general expected from the conquering American. He saluted first. Then he spoke in French. Not perfect French, not Parisian French. It was cavalry school French, Napoleon book French, the French of a man who had trained at Saumur and remembered that pride can be wounded long after the body survives. But it was French. And in that room, After 3 days of Americans killing Frenchmen, that mattered more than perfect grammar. They spoke of cavalry. They spoke of the old campaigns. They spoke of Marshal Foch, horses, honor, and the kind of war both men understood better than the mechanized one outside the hotel walls. By the end of the meal, Nogues had not forgotten defeat, but he had stopped feeling conquered. That was the difference Eisenhower noticed. A few days later, Patton went to Rabat to meet the Sultan of Morocco, Sidi Mohammed ben Yusuf. Again, he chose ritual over blunt power. Full-dress uniform, polished boots, cavalry bearing, protocol drilled into every American officer around him. Patton bowed with care. He addressed the Sultan through French, and then with formal Arabic phrases he had memorized. He did not behave like a temporary soldier passing through someone else's court. He behaved like the man across from him had a country. That sounds small only if you have never watched an empire run through intermediaries. The French resident general was supposed to stand between the Sultan and the outside world. Patton stepped around that arrangement without smashing it. He acknowledged the throne directly, and in Algiers, Dwight Eisenhower began reading the reports. Eisenhower had inherited a coalition held together with wire, pride, and cigarette smoke. Vichy officers distrusted Free French officers. Free French officers distrusted Vichy officers. De Gaulle distrusted almost everyone. Roosevelt distrusted de Gaulle. Churchill tolerated de Gaulle because he had run out of alternatives. And the Americans needed French cooperation without making France feel like a captured province. That was the diplomatic trap. Eisenhower did not need Frenchmen to love Americans. He needed them to accept American command while still believing they were acting as Frenchmen. And then Morocco sent him the answer: Patton. The wrong man for diplomacy was the perfect man for something deeper than diplomacy. He could make a defeated officer feel honored. He could make a proud ally feel seen. He could make American power appear ceremonial instead of crude. And he did all of it while looking too much like a soldier to be suspected of politics. That was the first time Eisenhower understood the weapon he had. Not a secret plan written in a file, not an order stamped confidential, just a recognition placed carefully in the back of his mind. One day France would need to be liberated. And when that day came, the Americans would need a general who could stand near French pride without stepping on it. That day arrived on August 1st, 1944. Utah Beach was no longer a killing ground. It had become a pipeline. Landing craft lowered their ramps, trucks rolled into the surf, tanks crawled inland over the same sand where men had died 8 weeks before. Out of one landing craft came a thin, restless French officer with a cane and a name that was not really his name. Philippe de Hautecloque had vanished in 1940 to protect his family in occupied France. The war knew him as Leclerc. Major General Jacques-Philippe Leclerc, commander of the French 2nd Armored Division, 16,000 men, hundreds of vehicles. Sherman tanks marked not only with the American White Star, but with the Cross of Lorraine. Leclerc had crossed Africa from Chad. He had sworn at Kufra that he would not stop until the French flag flew over Strasbourg. But there was one city he wanted before Strasbourg: Paris. He was driven inland from the beach to an American command post near Le Mans. There he met 2 American generals. One was Wade Hayslip, who spoke fluent French from his years at the École de Guerre. The other stood as if the 19th century had refused to release him. Riding breeches, high boots, pistols, straight back, hard eyes. George Patton. Leclerc expected the Americans to be crude, rich, overeager, and inexperienced. He expected to endure them because war had made endurance necessary. Then Patton saluted him, in French, and asked about Chad. That detail mattered, not because it was charming, but because it told Leclerc something American rank alone could not. This man had bothered to know who he was. Leclerc was proud, difficult, and politically loaded. His division was not just a military unit. It was a moving symbol of de Gaulle's claim that France had never truly surrendered. Wherever Leclerc went, politics followed. Eisenhower knew that. Bradley knew that. Patton may not have understood all of it, but Eisenhower did. The most delicate French division in the Allied order of battle ended up under commanders who could speak to it in its own language, inside Patton's Third Army. That was not just placement. It was containment without insult. Because Leclerc was not arriving to be swallowed by the American war machine, he was arriving to help restore France to itself. The question was, who would be allowed to do the restoring? By mid-August, Patton's Third Army was running across France so fast the maps seemed outdated by breakfast. Brittany, Le Mans, Chartres, Orléans. Fuel trucks could not keep pace. Staff officers fought with empty jerry cans, broken schedules, and roads clogged by refugees. Patton's advance looked less like a line and more like a door blown off its hinges. To the Germans, it was a nightmare. To Charles de Gaulle, it was something more complicated. De Gaulle needed Paris, not emotionally, politically. For 4 years, his entire claim rested on a dangerous sentence. France had not died in 1940. Vichy was not France. The real France had lived in exile, in the resistance. In Leclerc's columns crossing the desert. In the men and women hiding weapons under floorboards. But a claim needs an image, and the image was Paris. Whoever entered Paris as liberator would not merely take a city, he would define the government that followed. If American troops rolled down the Champs-Élysées first, France might be grateful, but gratitude is not sovereignty. So de Gaulle looked at the map and saw 2 races moving at once. Leclerc wanted Paris from the west. Patton was tearing east and south with a speed that could leave French glory behind him like dust. And Eisenhower did not want the city at all. To Eisenhower, Paris was a trap. 2 million civilians needed food, tons of supplies every day, fuel that was already scarce, road capacity that already could not support Patton, Montgomery, the British, the Canadians, the Americans, the medical columns, the ammunition columns, and the entire forward weight of a coalition army. A beautiful city could break an ugly supply line. So the plan was simple. Bypass Paris. Encircle it. Let German collapse and French pressure do the rest. Militarily, it made sense. Politically, it was gasoline beside a match. On August 20th, de Gaulle flew into France and met Eisenhower in Normandy. The conversation was polite only because both men understood the cost of losing control. De Gaulle said Paris was rising. Police were on strike. Resistance fighters were building barricades. Communists were armed. The Germans might slaughter the city before they left. Eisenhower listened and refused. Paris was not the objective. Then de Gaulle placed the real threat on the table. If Eisenhower would not order Leclerc into Paris, de Gaulle would. That was the moment the coalition nearly split inside its own victory. Leclerc's division served under American command by agreement, but its soul belonged to Free France. If de Gaulle ordered it to break away, it would go. If the Americans abandoned it and the Germans destroyed it in the streets, every liberation speech afterward would sound like betrayal. Eisenhower needed a reason to change the plan that did not look like surrendering to de Gaulle. He needed intelligence. He needed proof. And he needed it through an American chain of command. That proof arrived in Patton's sector. At 2 a.m. on August 22nd, Patton was awakened at a forward command post east of Chartres. A Frenchman had crossed the lines. His name was Roger Gallois, an officer from the French forces of the interior. He had come from Paris through German-held ground with one message. The uprising was real, and the truce inside the city was dying. The police had seized the prefecture. Barricades were going up. Armed civilians were exposed in the streets. The German commander, Dietrich von Choltitz, might not hold back his troops much longer. Without help, Paris could become a furnace. Patton received Gaulle in a bathrobe. That detail should be absurd. It was not, because the fate of Paris was not decided in a marble office. It passed through a canvas command post, a half-awake American general, and a French resistance officer desperate enough to cross a battle line. Patton heard him, believed enough to move the report, sent him upward. By morning, the information was with Omar Bradley. By noon, Eisenhower had it. And now Eisenhower had what he needed. Not de Gaulle's pressure, not political theater. American verified intelligence from the front. The decision changed. Leclerc would go to Paris. But notice the machinery. Patton did not love Paris. He wanted Metz. He wanted the German border. He wanted fuel, bridges, and another chance to break the enemy before the enemy could build a line. Yet the decisive report that released Leclerc into Paris passed through Patton. That was the hidden system working. The French could trust that Patton respected their pride. The Americans could trust that Patton was not playing French politics. Eisenhower could use Patton's front as the place where French urgency became military fact. And Patton still thought he was only fighting a war. On August 23rd, Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division began moving. 16,000 men, thousands of vehicles, a column stretching for miles through French villages that had waited 4 years to see their own flag without fear. They were supposed to reach Paris quickly. They did not. The roads were jammed with refugees, farm carts, broken German vehicles, crying civilians, and people who poured into the road to touch the tanks. Wine bottles appeared through hatches. Women kissed dust-covered soldiers. Old men stood with tricolors hidden since 1940. And through it all, the French column had to fight. Trappe, Toussaint-le-Noble, German roadblocks, burning vehicles, men killed within sight of the city they had crossed the world to reach. Leclerc kept driving. On August 25th, Paris fell. Choltitz surrendered. Leclerc entered the capital. De Gaulle prepared to walk into history. And far to the east, Patton received the news. He read it, folded it, gave it back. No speech, just the road. Drive. That was the second test, because the most dangerous American in French imagination was not Eisenhower, who smiled and negotiated. It was Patton, the tank general whose army seemed to outrun politics itself. If Patton had demanded the cameras, France would have remembered. If Patton had stood beside de Gaulle as co-owner of the victory, France would have noticed. If Patton's White Star tanks had claimed the symbolic center of the liberation, de Gaulle's government would have begun its life in an American shadow. Instead, Patton left the city to the French. Not because he was generous, not because he loved de Gaulle, not because he understood the whole political design. Because Paris was not a bridge, and Patton wanted bridges. That made him useful beyond calculation. France could see the Americans had the power to take the symbol and chose not to. De Gaulle could take the balcony, Leclerc could take the photographs, the crowds could take the memory. Patton took the road. But the crisis did not end when the Germans surrendered in Paris. Liberation does not automatically create a government. Sometimes it creates 5 men with guns who all believe history owes them authority. The French forces of the interior had fought in cellars, forests, railway yards, safe houses, and city streets. Some were Gaullists, some were communists, some were teenagers with stolen pistols, some were veterans of Spain, some had buried friends and carried grudges no government decree could erase. After Paris fell, they were armed inside the capital. De Gaulle now had the city, but not yet the state. On August 28th, he ordered the FFI to dissolve into the regular army or go home. In another country, that order might have started a civil war. In Paris, the resistance obeyed. Not because all wounds healed, Not because all factions loved de Gaulle, not because American officers settled the argument, because the map was still brutal. The Germans were in Lorraine. The Atlantic ports were still contested. Alsace was not free. France needed food, fuel, medicine, and a functioning army more than it needed rival militias claiming pieces of the capital. And the supplies feeding Paris moved through American depots, American trucks, American military police, and roads opened by armies still pushing east. At the far end of that pressure stood Patton, not issuing political threats, not lecturing French communists, not appearing in Paris as an occupier, just advancing. That was enough. The existence of Patton's drive made the argument smaller. It told every armed faction the same hard truth. The war had moved beyond the barricades, and anyone who wanted power in France had to survive the next German line first. De Gaulle disarmed the political crisis without American fingerprints on the order. Eisenhower understood the value of that. A threat spoken by Americans would have sounded like occupation. A road opened by Americans felt like necessity. Then came the final proof. After Paris, Leclerc could have remained close to de Gaulle's symbolic orbit. He had delivered the city. He had given Free France its image. He had earned the right to stand near the center of the new France. Instead, he asked to return to the American front. Back to Hayslip. Back to Third Army. Back to Patton. That request said more than any toast could. The proud French general, who had once expected Americans to be clumsy amateurs, now wanted to fight under the same American structure again. On September 12th, near Dompaire, in the foothills of the Vosges, Leclerc's division met the German 112th Panzer Brigade. The Germans had Panthers, better guns, heavy armor. A counterattack meant to claw back initiative and strike at the flank of Patton's army. On paper, the French should have paid dearly. But Leclerc did not fight the paper battle. He maneuvered. He set ambushes. He used ground, timing, infantry, armor, and American P-47 Thunderbolts overhead. German tanks pushed into killing zones and burned in the valleys. By the time it was finished, the 112th Panzer Brigade had been shattered as an effective force. The French had not merely received liberation. They had defended the American advance. That mattered, because the secret arrangement had never been that Americans would save France while France posed for history. The bargain was sharper and more honest than that. America would give France room to become France again. France would stop fighting itself long enough to fight Germany. Dompaire proved the bargain could work. Patton came to Leclerc's command post afterward with decorations. Silver stars, bronze stars. No grand press event, no carefully staged theater for the home front. He pinned the first medal on Leclerc himself and told him, in French, that he was proud to have such soldiers in his army. Leclerc cried. Not because medals are magic, because he finally understood what the Americans had done. They had not taken Paris from him. They had not stolen de Gaulle's moment. They had not made French courage decorative. They had absorbed the risk, supplied the tanks, carried the division through the Allied machine, released it at the exact political moment, and then welcomed it back as a fighting partner. Patton was the face of that paradox. The American general, most famous for fury, had become the American proof of restraint. That is why Eisenhower kept using him, not only because Patton moved fast, not only because he attacked hard, not only because German commanders feared his name. Eisenhower used Patton because Patton made a particular kind of political problem disappear. He was too visibly a soldier to look like an American governor, too obsessed with the next river to look like a man designing the future of France, too indifferent to French parties to be accused of favoring one, too respectful of French military pride to be dismissed as a crude conqueror. A real diplomat would have drawn suspicion. Patton drew arguments about gasoline. That was safer. The French fear in 1944 was not simply that Germany would return. It was that the liberator might become the new administrator, that France would be handled like a territory, that American colonels, American planners, and American supply officers would decide French life while French leaders waved flags for the cameras. Patton's behavior answered that fear without ever naming it. He bowed to the Sultan and moved on. He saluted Nogues and moved on. He welcomed Leclerc and moved on. He let Paris have its French liberators and moved on. He honored the French at Dompaire and moved on. Again and again the message was the same. The United States had not crossed the ocean to own France. It wanted the road to Germany. Patton died in December 1945 after a car accident in Germany. He was buried among his soldiers in Luxembourg in a grave as plain as the men around him. He left no confession of a secret diplomatic mission, no memoir chapter explaining how Eisenhower used him as political cover, no grand realization that his most important service in France may have been what he did not take. That is what makes the story so strange. He had been a commander, he had been a weapon, he had been a symbol, but the symbol only worked because he did not know he was one. Tell Patton he was an ambassador, and he might have performed diplomacy. Leave him as Patton, and he performed something better. He made American power look temporary. He made French pride survivable. He gave Eisenhower a way to let de Gaulle win the image, let Leclerc win the city, let the resistance fold into the state, and still keep the Allied armies moving toward Germany. The secret was never a coded order. It was a placement, a pattern. A man pointed in the right direction. On August 25, 1944, Paris looked west for its liberators and found French tanks in the streets. Patton looked east and saw another river. France took the balcony. Patton took the road.